without heroes.
The Legend of the Elder, conceived, written, and performed by Kiss on Casablanca Records, the new Kiss album.
Hey everybody, this is TJR. If this is your first time, welcome to the channel. If not, welcome back. And recently, I picked up a copy of this. This is Music from the Elder by Kiss. And this is a special half-speed mastering from Germany. I'm pretty sure this is the first time I've ever picked up an import LP. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but first, I want to talk a little bit about the history of this album and the album that followed it. Released in 1981, Music from the Elder was the band's 9th studio album. It was the first one with new drummer Eric Carr, who replaced original drummer Peter Criss. It would be the last one to feature original lead guitarist Ace Frehley. And reportedly, the Elder was just one more nail in the coffin for him as far as staying in the band was concerned. To add insult to injury, the album was also a financial flop, and the band didn't even tour behind it. It was mostly trounced by critics or met with indifference, with some placing it in their worst albums list. Remaining original members Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley would later express public embarrassment over the album as well. And it's a shame, because it might not have all been so bad had things gone just a little bit differently. Leading up to the Elder, Kiss released Dynasty in 1979 and Unmasked in 1980. These two albums saw the band progressively moving more and more into a pop music direction. This strategy was winning fans in Europe, but it was slowly alienating their fan base back home in the US, who loved them for their original hard rock sound. This, coupled with all the intense merchandising, such as action figure toys and starring in a really bad kids movie, had their fans calling them sellouts. They went from being a band that parents considered dangerous to a band that parents took their kids to see. Now, the music buying public of any era can be very unforgiving if a music artist they love starts to stray musically too far from what made them love them in the first place. I can remember listening to Unmasked back when it was released, and I'll admit there were songs like Shandy and Torpedo Girl that strayed really deeply into pop that I thought were really fun. But there was also an equal number of truly uninspired tracks, and I could see how the album was hurting their credibility with their fans. Now, after Unmasked, the band stated in their fan newsletter that they would be returning back to their hard rock roots. It seemed like the smartest move they could have made at the time. And had they done this, I think there was still a chance that they could have salvaged the trust lost between them and their core fan base. So it was a real surprise to walk into the record store and find the Kiss logo on a very mysterious looking album cover that, for the first time, didn't feature the band anywhere on the front or the back cover, and was called Music from the Elder. So let me talk about this release here. The first thing you might notice is how different the band's logo looks. This is because on the original logo, the S's look suspiciously like the Nazi SS. So for that reason, they're changed in all German releases. This was actually a anniversary repressing of the album that was released in Germany only. It was limited on a transparent vinyl and came with an extra print of the Japanese version of the cover and a special lyric sheets in both English and German. I unfortunately missed out on that release. I was rather surprised to find out that it had come out months and months later after it had been released. I managed, however, to still get a copy without the extras on plain black vinyl that featured the half-speed mastering. And I could tell the half-speed mastering because, honestly, I've never heard the album sound this good before. But let me get back to the history now. Stories on why Kiss chose to go in this direction vary. In his biography, Paul Stanley stated that they, meaning Gene and Paul, wanted to prove something to all of their critics who dismissed them as juvenile by releasing something that was more musically complex and what they believed had some lyrical substance as well. Music from the Elder was produced by Bob Ezrin, who had produced their Destroyer album. Bob Ezrin had just finished producing Pink Floyd's The Wall, and reportedly it was Ezrin who first suggested the idea of creating a concept album to the band. Both Simmons and Stanley liked the idea, with Ace Frehley being the only member who was against it. Ace encouraged that they stick with their original plan of releasing a straight-ahead heavy rock album, but he got voted down 2-1. This was because new drummer Eric Carr, who was portrayed in the press as a full member, was in reality a hired gun, an employee. He had no say-so in the matter. During the time of its release, Kiss would mention in interviews that they had big plans for the album. They mentioned that there were plans for a feature film based on the album. Of course, all of this fell through when the album flopped. During the 70s, the costumes the band wore on stage would change and evolve. For the Elder, it was decided to give themselves another costume makeover. This also included losing the platform shoes and everybody cutting their hair short. It was not their best look. My thoughts on hearing the album back in the day were that it was a pretty good album, way better than the last two, but kind of disjointed, more of a loosely themed album than an actual concept album. What I didn't realize at the time, though, was that their record label kneecapped the album right out the gate by changing the intended track order. The album's original track listing had 3 quiet openers before we heard any of the hard rock sound that Kiss was known for. And this scared their record label into changing the track order so that it opened with a heavy rock track, a song that was intended to open side 2, entitled The Oath. Other tracks were moved around as well, for reasons unknown to me, but I'm guessing to keep the album from having too many quieter tracks next to each other. So imagine Tommy by The Who opening with the track Christmas, then going to the overture, and then followed by Go to the Mirror. And you kind of get an idea of what listening to the original version was like. Now, I want to add that this was all pre-internet, but during their interviews to promote the album, I never heard or read a word from Gene or Paul complaining about the track order being changed. In fact, I wouldn't know about any of this until 1997, when The Elder was re-released as part of a remastered catalog series. It was on this re-release that the original track listing was restored. In my opinion, restoring the intended song order helps the album feel more cohesive. I feel that side 1 is stronger than side 2, and that all the tracks are enjoyable. One thing here that's really I should point out here is you've got a song here. It's called Mr. Blackwell, with the writing credits Gene Simmons and Lou Reed. Yeah, that Lou Reed. In fact, Lou Reed is also on the credits for this song here, A World Without Heroes, written by Paul Stanley, Bob Ezrin, Lou Reed, and Gene Simmons. It's all right there. Yeah, Lou Reed. Put that in your hipster pipe and smoke it. But let's make one thing clear. It's not Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, or Tommy by The Who. It's not even Nostradamus by Judas Priest. The Elder is a Marvel comic set to rock and roll, and there's nothing wrong with that. Just like Gene Simmons, I grew up on comics, and in our current world, where superhero films have been a world-conquering film genre for over 10 years now, this album actually feels ahead of its time in some respects. And it was great to hear them try something different. And regardless of any commercial or critical success or failure, I will always applaud a band or music artist for stretching their boundaries and getting out of their comfort zone. But it was the wrong move for the band at the time. In 1982, Kiss would follow up The Elder with Creatures of the Night. their leanest, meanest, and heaviest sounding album up to that point. But at this point, it was too little, too late. Too much of the core fan base had moved on. Creatures of the Night was an album that should have been released back in 1981. This album could have gone a long way in repairing the lost trust done by Dynasty and Unmask. And had they followed up Creatures of the Night with The Elder, I think the fan base would have been more open to it versus how things did turn out. And also, there's a strong possibility that Ace Frehley might have stayed with the band longer too. Instead, Creatures of the Night was a great album that flopped. It would take some time, but the band would eventually bounce back. All those kids whose parents took them to see Kiss eventually grew up and created a whole new adult fan base for them. In time, The Elder would also get a reappraisal as well, and it's good to see that it did because it is a fun and enjoyable rock album. Also, with comic book movies being so widely accepted today, I think that rock audiences now can better understand what they were going for with this album than they could have in the early 80s, when reading comic books banned you as a social leper among some peer groups. In time, Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley would soften their stance on The Elder and refer to it as a good album, but just not a good Kiss album. To that I have one word of criticism. I think that after its release, Gene and Paul should have stood behind it rather than expressing embarrassment over it. It's not like these two guys can hide behind the, well, we were delving into heavy drugs at the time excuse. They obviously must have liked what they were hearing in the studio, or they wouldn't have released it. Instead, it feels like they jumped onto their own bandwagon of hate and jeers in order to distance themselves from it as quickly as possible. So much so that they originally were not going to include it in the remastered series I mentioned earlier. So I don't think The Elder was a mistake, just a misstep of timing, an album that was mostly misunderstood when it came out. Change the release order, and things might have turned out quite differently. But those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. If you like these videos, please show your support by clicking like, hitting subscribe. You can also do a super thanks and make a small donation. Patron supporters to this channel do receive exclusive weekly videos not available on the channel. So I might also encourage you to check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/TJR the original. Oh, and they also get their names in the credits. Mostly though, I want to thank you just for making it here to the end of the video, and just thank you so much for hanging out. I'll see you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.